All right, we are streaming, Chair.
All right, good morning. I guess it's afternoon. You wrote good morning on the script, Sasha. Good afternoon. I'm Andy Barnett, and I would like to welcome you all to the May 30th, 2024 Affordable Housing Advisory Committee meeting. It's been a minute since we have done one of these meetings virtually, so bear with us. All committee members and staff are participating virtually, and we're streaming live on our virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city website and also linked on the AHAC committee page. We have an option for the public to dial in and listen and comment by phone. That is 855-925-2801 and use meeting code 7663 to listen in. For those of you who are out there today on those platforms, welcome. We're going to have devote the bulk of this special meeting to reviewing the draft implementation plan for the housing plan that we've been working on for the last several months. We're excited to have Jarrah Smith from Enterprise back with us to walk us through that roadmap. We're going to start though right now with a roll call for all the committee members. So I will introduce you, call your name, come off mute, let us know that you're here, and then we will, you can go back on mute. So let's do that now. Brian Methvin, Vice Chair.
I am here.
All right. Scott Adams.
I'm here.
All right. David Bartholomew.
I'm also here.
Great. Jane Kristen.
Also here.
Great. Chris Day could not join us today on this different time. Paul Heathman.
I'm here.
Okay. Tara Irby.
Here.
Rita Lee. I didn't see Rita join us. Babs Phillip. And Babs is also not with us. Wayna Smith.
Present.
All right. And Stuart Zitten. Okay. And then our, glad to have our council liaison, Councilmember Antoinette Mosley with us as well.
Good afternoon, everyone.
All right. Very good. I think our first order of business is to vote to approve minutes from our March meeting.
And Chair Barnett,
Yes.
I did not have time to quite finish those. I had the basic outline of them, but it didn't really have the conversation captured. So they're not in your folder. So I'm sorry about that, everybody, but I'll get that to you as soon as I can.
All right. We will just plan to approve March and May minutes at our next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we will roll right along to the meat of our discussion, which is the affordable housing plan. And we're really excited to see the progress that Enterprise has made since our last meeting in March. We spent a lot of time looking at where they were and sort of coming up with draft recommendations, and we're anxious to see some of those recommendations fleshed out and kind of what the implementation plan would look like. We spent a lot of time on that in our last meeting, looking forward anxiously to a little bit of a drill down that we're going to get today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Jarrah Smith with Enterprise Community Partners and let him walk us through the progress that they've made since the last time we took a look at this plan. Jarrah?
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair and Councilmember Mosley for having me today. It's good to see you all. Good to be back virtually. I'm glad to be discussing our implementation roadmap today. It is still a work in progress, but I love being able to bring you all in and help us fill in some gaps, identify areas that we might be missing, or add some additional nuance where it's needed. So just to take everyone through a quick reminder of what we've been through thus far. We have done extensive analysis of housing and demographic data using both census data as well as local data. And of course, we've done a lot of community and stakeholder engagement stretching from October through April, most notably, most recently, our March trip where we presented our preliminary strategy recommendations and followed up with a survey in April. So what we're doing right now is the city staff is reviewing the draft plan, and we're fine-tuning the implementation roadmap itself. And the next steps, crucially, will be on June 10th, a working group of AHAC members will review the draft plan. And then on June 25th, I'll be returning for a city council work session to go over the near final draft plan at that point. Also, I should say, you know me, I love to have an open conversation, so please feel free to jump in with questions at any time. Please raise your hand and I'll try and call on you. If I don't, the chair will call on you in case I accidentally don't see your hand, but please feel free to jump in and interrupt and ask questions or make comments at any point during today's presentation. So I want to start off by reminding us all of the 5 primary goals for the Affordable Housing Plan. Number 1, just underpinning everything is broadening and strengthening the affordable housing ecosystem. As I've said many times, there's a lot of players in this space in Asheville. There's a lot of positive momentum and a lot of eagerness to support affordable housing. And so the question is, how do we bring everyone together and leverage our communal resources? Similarly, we want to make sure that we're aligning place-based policies, or that's more like locationally specific policies and programs with the related city initiatives. We know that Asheville's housing market is not a monolith, so what can be done to tailor specific recommendations for specific parts of the city? And with those in mind, we want to make sure that we're promoting policies and resources that help existing residents stay in Asheville. That's our people-focused goal. We also, of course, want to pay attention to the housing stock itself. So we're preserving existing affordable housing and improving housing quality, and we're increasing the supply of housing that meets the diverse needs of the city's current and future residents. After some feedback from the community, we revised our cross-cutting priorities, and we're focusing on these 2 in particular: prioritizing, incentivizing, and/or supporting efforts that meet the greatest need. More specifically, that's looking at supporting families of very low income, less than 60% AMI, looking at more permanent or long-term affordability requirements for city-supported developments, and improving housing so that there's more accessibility to all varieties of folks within the city. We also feel it's important to protect against displacement in all forms, whether that's physical displacement, where people are moved out of their homes or removed from their communities. There's economic displacement, where property taxes or rents are so high that they can't afford to live there anymore. Perhaps that might be the case for businesses as well. There's cultural and social displacement, when there's just a loss of the social fabric and a loss of the feeling of belonging as folks are displaced out of their community. And then there's environmental displacement, which is caused by natural disasters or related climate issues. Again, reflecting the feedback that we heard from the community, we initially had advancing racial justice as one of those cross-cutting priorities, but we felt that it needed to be elevated as its own independent, specific topic. And so we've decided that we want to make sure that we're centering racial justice throughout the whole plan, which I think has been on theme for the entire planning process. But we wanted to, in particular, point out that as the city implements this plan over the next 10 years, given its commitment to racial equity, we want to suggest that the city uses Race Forward's racial equity impact assessment framework as they develop policies and programs, make funding decisions, and set new policy goals. So in particular, as the city begins to implement this plan, they should ask questions like, how will BIPOC community members be meaningfully engaged in the development of policies, programs, or initiatives? How will this policy, program, initiative positively impact BIPOC community members? Equally as important, how might the policy, program, or initiative inadvertently negatively impact BIPOC community members? Does the proposal inadvertently exclude BIPOC community members, for instance? Also, are resources being allocated equitably across the city rather than being reinforced by patterns of disinvestment and segregation? How can the proposal be altered to mitigate harm and improve outcomes for BIPOC community members? And how will outcomes of the policy, program, or initiative be measured and evaluated? I believe a hand was raised.
Jared, that was me. Can you just go back one slide?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So we had 4 initially. We had we had these two, plus we had advancing racial equity and data-informed decisions. And so we, as I said, we've kind of separated centering racial equity out as its own central focus, and data-informed decisions, we've basically integrated that as an essential part of the implementation roadmap. So we're not getting rid of that priority of making data-informed decisions and improving data collection and data enforcement issues. It's just that we felt like it didn't quite rise to the same level as incentivizing these particular greatest needs or protecting against displacement.
Yeah, I wanted to look back at this because I like the clarity that's created by having just two, but it's taken me a minute just to sit with the focus on 60% AMI and below, sort of very low income households, and the work around housing stability or anti-displacement work. When we say these are the two priorities in this plan, that feels like a very powerful statement, and points to the fact that we don't necessarily at this moment in time have resource alignment around that. And so I'm just I'm feeling that as we're as you're putting this up. I think you've heard clearly from the community on this. It's just landing kind of hard.
Yeah, I absolutely hear you. And actually, I'm going to get to that in just a second. So I'm glad that you mentioned it. Any other questions or thoughts on the priorities or goals? Go ahead, Brian.
I mean, I think the 60% AMI target for renters is a good goal. I'm not sure there's as widespread community support for that for home ownership, and a lot of your recommendations and strategies are around home ownership, because that's going to leave a massive donut hole in the community of people who would qualify for down payment assistance and some of the other programs, but wouldn't because of the AMI.
I certainly hear you. Right. Okay. I understand what you mean. And so I should clarify, our policies are not only prioritizing those at 60% below AMI, because you're absolutely right. We don't want to ignore the 60 to 80% folks as well. It's just that right now we're recognizing that city tools and funding primarily benefits that particular AMI bracket. And so we're trying to figure out what recommendations can help expand the scope and reach that deeper affordability. But I think you make a great point about the distinction between homeowners and renters here.
Yeah, because I do believe on the rental side, we have a crisis amongst people who are 60, 70% and less on the AMI side, not being able to access housing at all.
Right.
Whereas I think the home ownership issue is probably likely a more important issue for those in the sort of 70, 80, 90% AMI, because there's just no housing available in Asheville for them. And the down payment assistance programs just don't work at the moment for anybody below 60% AMI. So if we prioritize them at all on the home ownership side, we're going to see almost no results.
Okay. I hear you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Okay. Great. Any other thoughts? Great. Keep rolling. Okay. So the meat of the conversation, the implementation roadmap, just a couple framing slides before we actually get into the work session. So number one, these are essential elements for implementation success. And Andy, like I said, you read my mind, because number one is we need to invest in people and systems. These programs and policies and initiatives cannot be administered without adequate staff, the necessary tools, or the systems in place. And that means scaling teams and city staff infrastructure is absolutely crucial. And to your point about advancing racial equity, protecting against displacement, integrating racial equity itself into these systems is additional work. It's being thoughtful about this process. It's not just something that can be layered in to additional capacity, as if there were additional capacity at the city level right now. It is absolutely essential that if the city is serious about integrating racial equity into their implementation, that there needs to be more staff to help actually make that happen. Number two, as I referenced earlier, making data-informed decision-making. Sure, Brian, go ahead.
I think it is worth calling out on that first thing. You've said scaling city staff and infrastructure is essential. I would think it would be good to call out that our current city staff is inadequate to implement these recommendations.
Yes.
Not that Sasha is inadequate.
No.
But that we don't have enough people to do even half of what you put in here. And I would hate to see council say, yes, this is what we want to do, but not increase the budget for community and economic development, because then nothing will happen.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Brian, and thank you for making that point. Yeah, absolutely. I know how hard Sasha and Alex and Nikki are working. I know how over capacity they are, and just today, to your point, there needs to be more city staff supporting affordable housing, supporting racial equity, let alone implementing our 40 some odd recommendations. So thank you. I appreciate you bringing up that point. So as I was saying, making data-informed decision-making. So again, we're not losing this as a priority, but we're making sure to focus it as a part of the implementation process. As I said before, Asheville's housing market is not a monolith, so it's really important to understand the needs and challenges with as much nuance as possible. And data collection itself is going to, again, require additional staff capacity. It also requires utilizing credible quantitative and qualitative data sources. It's not just looking at how many numbers of homes are produced, because the city is not a developer and that's not necessarily in the city's control. It's important to keep track of that, but it's really important to also think about people's lived experiences. So it's essential that we include qualitative data sources as part of the decision-making process as well. And overall, we just need to understand what are the data gaps, what are the data limitations. That's been part of the process for this affordable housing plan, and is a part of the implementation plan. And then last, we want to state that really, this implementation roadmap is a living document. As we all know, housing markets ebb and flow. There's only so many people who saw the 2007 crisis happening. We never know what will happen. Also, organizations evolve, their missions change, their capacity grows, or diminishes, their goals are changing. So we understand that the folks who are going to be in charge of uplifting these strategies may in fact change and evolve over time. And so really we need to make sure that as implementation goes forward, the roadmap needs to be periodically reevaluated for urgency, relevancy, and feasibility. So as I present this roadmap, there's 4 primary categories to think about, though there's a couple extra columns like community priorities and state legislative agenda items. But number 1 is prioritizing when these will be implemented. And we created a 4-bracketed system. The first one being top priorities. What are the things that we can really hit the ground running in year 1 to get started working on? Then we're looking at the short-term priorities. What maybe has some momentum but requires a little bit more capacity building, a little bit more funding, or just a little bit more thought. Those goes into the short-term priorities of 2 to 3 years. They're also intentionally trying to address those heart attacks, the greatest needs that we were talking about last time. Then we're looking at the medium-term priorities. These ideas are perhaps need a lot more thought. The funding still needs to be identified, or there needs to be more studies done in order to put them in place. But we still want to make sure that the work is undertaken in the next 4 to 5 years. And then last, we have the long-term priorities, which falls in the 6 to 10 year category. So that still falls within a bond cycle because some of these are eligible for bond usage. However, they may require state legislative advocacy. They may require the greatest amount of collaboration and organization. They may require the most significant accumulation of and coordination of funds. So that's why we put them in the long-term priorities bucket. That said, one of the things that I'd love to hear from you all today is if we should be moving these prioritization brackets around a little bit. If some short term should become top priorities, if some medium term should go to the long term, or whatever the case may be. Then we also look at how the strategies will be supported by actionable steps. As you all saw on the roadmap that was presented to you earlier, there are italicized smaller text under each strategy that's supposed to represent actual steps that the city can take to bring that strategy to fruition. Then who will be the stakeholder charged with uplifting each strategy? In many cases, it will be the city, but also that might be a different department in the city. It's not necessarily community and economic development, but of course, as we all know, the theme of this plan is broadening and strengthening the ecosystem. So there's a lot more players at hand than just the city. So who are the stakeholders? Who are the organizations who are going to collaboratively work to make these strategies come to life? And then last, funding. Where will it come from? Does it need to just come from the general fund for supporting city staff time? Does it need to come out of the bond, the housing trust fund, CDBG funds, whatever the case may be? We're trying to identify what sources can actually pay for these particular strategies, so they're not just pie in the sky ideas. So I'm going to take you through these 4 questions as we go through the various spreadsheets that were sent your way earlier last week. But the questions that I would love for you all to focus on are, number 1, are there any crucial strategies that are missing? I would love to hear if there are. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that because I've asked that question, I feel, ad nauseum, but I absolutely want to give you all another bite at the apple to let me know, is there anything crucial, any of those big bucket strategies that we're not thinking of? As I said earlier, we'd love to know if you would like to, if you think we should adjust the prioritization framework, if we should shift some priorities into higher priority time frame and be accomplished sooner, or should we move them back because they're not as pressing of an issue as our interpretation. We'll also be presenting a spreadsheet that actually highlights the strategies that are bond eligible. So I'd love to hear from you all about what are your maybe top 2 to 3 strategies that you would like to prioritize bond funding for. And then last, do you have any additional creative ideas for actionable steps, as in those little italicized bits under each strategy? Do you have any creative ideas, or is there anything missing or that needs additional explanation or more nuanced wording? I would love to get your thoughts on all of that. So let me pull up the implementation table. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, maybe I missed this. Sorry if I did. When we say a year, we're going to have them complete within a year, or we're going to get started on them sometime
Get started.
in the next 12 months?
Get started. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. That's a very important clarification. Yeah, so get started. And when we're talking about get started, we're probably talking more like end of summer, fall. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Sasha, but we're not talking about, July 1, work's going to get started on all of these immediately. That said, a lot of the top priority ones are the ones that already have a lot of momentum going for them. But yes, it is about starting those particular strategies, not necessarily being able to check the box and say, this is done within year 1, this is done within years 2 or 3, because that would require starting on all of them now. And as we've said, is not the capacity, the funding to do that. So this is about starting them and being smart about utilizing city resources, utilizing city time over the next 10 years. Great. Okay. So let's start with prioritization. Now, I encourage you all, I am going to share my screen. As we all know, spreadsheets are not the best for legibility, so I encourage all of you and everyone at home to look at the handout that is on AHAC's website if you'd like to look a little bit more closer, if this in any way is difficult to read. But so as you can see, these are not broken out by goals specifically. This is just looking at the prioritization of each strategy. And there are elements from each goal in each particular time frame. So in my hope that you've all reviewed this beforehand, I'm curious, do any jump out as being misplaced in terms of priority? Should any of the year 1s drop back to short move up to year 1, or medium long, should they move around? Any thoughts on the placement of these in particular? And I should say we have talked with city staff about this as well, so I've got their input too, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we might be misjudging in terms of prioritization. And so I'll let you all look at this for a couple minutes and think about it. Go ahead, Brian.
So I'm curious why emergency rental assistance went to a 4 to 6 year time horizon. That seems like something easily doable in the near term.
That's a great question. So I'm hearing that you think it should get moved up to either year 1 or years 2 or 3. I believe that the reasoning was mostly because it was figuring out the funding. I don't believe it's one of the bond eligible sources. I could be mistaken about that. I apologize for not having those memorized, but that's a good point because it is important. That helps meet the need quickly. So I think we can take a look at that and see if we can move that up to the shorter term.
Just to interject, Jara, I can be on hand to answer any of those bond questions. I'll have my notes open, but yes, we did review all these strategies with our legal team and our bond counsel to just really provide specific direction on what was bond eligible or what wasn't. And I am afraid that emergency rental assistance, because bond dollars really have to be linked towards capital expenditures, and that's really part of the test that we have to examine. Emergency rental assistance is not applicable for bond dollars. So I do think that's one of the major drivers of why it's in the medium category despite the need.
Thank you, Nikki. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Brian, and I understand there might be good reasons the city doesn't feel like it can achieve that at this time, but it is clearly should be a top priority right now. It's what people will need right now when there aren't affordable units. It's the fastest way to keep people in their homes, and homelessness has its own cost. I mean, I know that's separate from the affordable housing plan, but we know how directly correlated it is. And it's a very expensive problem too. The city's going to be spending a lot of money on shelter. The city's going to be spending a lot of money on enforcement. So maybe the bond money isn't the answer here, but I do think we want to have that as a very high priority because it's going to help people immediately. And this plan needs to start helping people immediately because so many of these things do take time.
Right.
Do you have any? Can I ask a question? Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Sasha.
Maybe it's for David. I think the other thing we were thinking about when we were doing this is like, are we creating a new program? Do we have to create new infrastructure, right, for something, for one of these things? And so I think I was thinking about this actually earlier for this one today. I think it's simpler if it's like the city partners with, or one of those small steps, like if we're funneling money to an agency that's already doing this kind of thing. That's a lot simpler than if we're creating a whole new program that needs staff. Is that, and maybe we don't get into that right now, but.
No, I want this to be a work session where we're talking about all that stuff. So that feels.
I don't know if you, David, or somebody else has a suggestion of what would be the best step to make that happen, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
And I think that, that could be a year one thing. Certainly, there are a lot of different agencies administering rental assistance. The biggest one over the past few years has been the county through DSS.
Right.
And they do have the infrastructure, but, I understand working with the county and figuring out how that would work is not easy. There's a lot of other agencies that, I think would want a seat at the table to talk about how that would work. And it could be that it doesn't require just the city to be the lead on it, but the city is going to need to, prioritize funding it because honestly, the administration of this is difficult, but it's, we're talking about direct cash to keep people in their homes. So.
And so, David, do you have any thoughts on, because, traditionally or often, emergency rental assistance was provided through federal fundings through ARPA. Do you have any thoughts on where the city where the funding should come from in the short term?
Well, so that's a little bit out of my depth, I would say. I know I follow the city budget process, and I know there's been a decision not to raise taxes right now, and it's really out of my depth to comment on all these budget issues. It's very complicated, and I understand that, but it needs to be a priority because it costs the city money either way, and that's what I was trying to say. And so I don't have the easy answer, and I know it isn't easy, but we need to think about locally because the cost is local. And I understand that federal money has stopped, and that's a big part of why DSS doesn't have rental assistance now. And I understand how expensive it is, but I do think when you really look at the cost benefit here, it's something that pays off for the city, and it is a short-term thing that we need to address.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
So separately, as I look through the top priorities, I know it's kind of mixed into some of these elements, but I don't see like go build more housing for rental properties. I mean, we're going to pass a bond, hopefully. And if we do, where would that bond go according to these priorities? And what I just don't see is like one of them that just calls out and screams, go build more affordable housing that's tied to vouchers.
Okay.
And I just think it needs to be there, because otherwise we might spend our money on supporting construction of affordable housing for sale, right? Because that is called out in here as a priority, but not for rental units. And I wasn't quite sure as to why.
Okay, no, that's a good distinction. Thank you for noting that. And you're absolutely right. It is kind of peppered in, but I think we can take a look at perhaps making something more explicit along those lines.
I think in particular, we have some nonprofit developers in town that are doing permanently affordable projects like Mountain Housing. Haywood Street's just done one. Howard Bound's done one. I mean, these are developments in the community that address one of your things in here about making sure this is long term. We should, I think, in my mind, be doing more to support those kinds of developers who are going to build permanently affordable housing for primarily people under 80% AMI and readily accept vouchers.
Right. Great. Thank you, Brian. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, I would support, adding some very specific language on just increasing units. I will say, a lot of what I see in top priorities are like policy focused, which it does seem very easy, or it should be very easy for us to like do the policy work, because it doesn't require a bunch of funding like some of these other things. But I don't know to what degree we'll have council's support on what we know are going to be changes to code that will allow for building more densely. And that goes hand in hand with the infrastructure, water, sewer being available, and us having like an overarching plan for our city. So I don't know exactly what I'm saying there, but I know that, if we change the policy, we still need water and sewer in the areas where, and then also it's tough. I don't know how council is digesting, these recommendations and how they're feeling about them, but we would need council support, to do most everything it feels like in the top priorities. So hopefully we have it.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Well, I'd suggest tuning in on June 25th to see what City Council has to say.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Brian.
A good example of what Paul's talking about would be to invest city funds in like sewer infrastructure that would unlock developable land in town, which currently isn't, because MSD requires that a developer pay for that, but we have no large parcels. We just have all small parcels.
Right.
So we have pieces of land could be developed, aren't, because it has to be on septic. So the only thing that can go in there is low density single family housing.
Right. Great point. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, to that point, we end up with one house and we could have had 4 or 6 or 8 on the parcel that only has one. So
right. So one of the things that we do have in here, though I hear your emphasis on prioritizing those particular things, is in the short term towards the bottom, third from the bottom, we do talk about aligning housing development priority areas with capital improvement plans. We talk about for supporting city subsidized, developing affordable housing on city subsidized properties. Perhaps that's just investing in the needed infrastructure. Because you're absolutely right. Time and time I've heard again, how limited the developable space is in the city of Asheville. And so we really want to make sure we're maximizing these opportunities. And that means making sure that the infrastructure is there and making sure that we're appropriately aligning with the city's investments. Paul, I believe you were first.
Yeah, well, let me just restate. If we change the policy and open things up too, and we don't have the ability to build dense development, then those lots we have to like bring the infrastructure and the plan with the policy, or we'll just end up with a bunch of, high-end single-family homes on all those new lots.
Okay, I see what you mean. Similar to, we can't implement these without staff. We don't want to implement these policies if we're not laying the foundation for them to be actually maximized, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, Paul and everybody's already talking about it, and I appreciate you pointing out that item in the short about aligning development priorities with capital improvement plan. The unique thing here is our city doesn't run our sewer department, and so I don't know. And this is maybe more of a question for staff. I don't. Be really interesting. I don't know if city bonds could propose to build sewer infrastructure. Interestingly enough, MSD, who is our sewer authority, their bylaws don't allow them to build new sewer lines. They are developer driven. So their charter allows them to maintain and improve and replace. But one of our local issues is that we have no one besides developers, by and large, extending sewer infrastructure, which is so crucial. So it's either using some type of this affordable housing plan and creating some group that's helping to lobby and change the rules at our local sewer authority, or maybe, I'd be really curious if someone, if there was a way that the city or the county could actually fund sewer infrastructure projects. It's just a little weird because it's not, the city runs the water department, but it doesn't run the sewer department. So the idea is it's an interesting scenario.
Sorry, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, no, I this is great. And I think what I would be inclined to do is that when we talk about looking in short 2-3, if you see there's 2 items that we may want to then call out our MSD partners, but increase capacity of the public sector by fostering collaboration, that definitely could be included in that, just to again explore everything you're saying, Chris, is how do they make decisions, how can we foster collaboration in those decisions, just really fostering collaboration with MSD for this housing piece. And then secondly, I'm seeing aligning housing development priority areas with the capital improvement plan. For now, that had been really well, and really the transit oriented development. I think all those pieces we could seek to incorporate infrastructure into those considerations. So right now, that capital improvement plan, that was pretty specific to the city's capital improvement plan, but perhaps we should really then also nod towards water, being clear, water is a city capital improvement plan, but still like making sure that is called out as well as MSD. So I think those are great comments, but I do think we can leverage those existing priorities to then include those infrastructure pieces. And I know that we've been able to use bond dollars to invest in sewer and water infrastructure on city property. I think the difference would be, could we use it for affordable housing projects? So again, that's something we could take a look at, but it's well known we did that for the 319 Biltmore project, and we used bond dollars to do so.
Scott, before I call on you, I do have one super in the weeds question, and it's okay if we don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm curious, the requirement that MSD not construct sewer lines, is that something that they have the authority to amend that bylaw, or is that something that we'd need to go to the state for that kind of enabling change?
I don't.
state. Paul, are you
I-
pointing state? Sorry.
I feel like it's the state. I'll say it's twofold. It is one, the laws, the rules or the charter, how it's set up would have to be changed. And I don't know if that's a state thing, but it's also just changing some, this is the way we've done it for
Right.
25 years.
Sure. Yeah.
Ideology.
Right. Great. Scott, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly piggyback while we're in the infrastructure or in the weeds on infrastructure. So another observation that I've had, at least across the city, are unbuilt right-of-ways. And I don't know if there's any opportunity to infuse that into the bond conversation, particularly when you've got a nexus of a property that's already owned by fill in the blank X affordable entity or the city. But oftentimes that's a huge lift, particularly if you're trying to do, even a smaller scale project. If you don't have frontage or you don't have, an active street frontage in front of you, that can be a huge lift if you're building it up to even nominal public standards. So I guess, throwing that question in the mix of, eligibility of bond funds for the city to be the, street builder of record on unbuilt right of ways, since it is already very often, public right of way. That's another critical issue for just literally opening up the street frontage to properties that oftentimes are just, laying undeveloped. And it's that hurdle of, having that street frontage.
Do you have any sense of what the supply is of that? Like, is there a lot of unbuilt right-of-ways that could be turned into roads and add frontage that would open up for opportunities for development? Or is it more like that's kind of something like a deeper analysis that would be needed, and it'd be like piecemeal here and there? Do you have any sense on the scale?
Probably a deeper analysis. I mean, I think oftentimes it's kind of a two-part thing. Like, you've got what's, was originally platted, in the 20s or beforehand. And then there may be instances of, it's the width of the right of way is not up to current standards, or the topography may or may not dictate that. I guess that's a whole other, side conversation for, maximum grade on local streets and whatnot. But generally right now, at least under fire code, you can go up to 15% on local streets, and potentially up to 18% if you sprinkler and do other sort of supplementary measures. But in terms of a percentage of the city that has unbuilt right of ways, I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but they're sprinkled all over.
Yeah,
that.
Right. And especially in a city that's so difficult to find new developable property, that's a really smart idea. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
Jane, go ahead, please.
Yeah, as long as we're fine moving away from the capital improvements investment conversation, one of the other things that I wanted to raise was sitting under the medium priority, so the 4 to 5 years, creating a centralized affordable housing waitlist and application portal. It seems like a lot of good implementers and community partners have been identified. And so I wonder if that could be bumped up to more of a shorter term priority, especially understanding what is being built with regards to new construction for affordable housing in our city, and just making sure that access to that information is available to our residents within the community.
Great. Well, so I'm aware of Just Economics is putting together a common application and getting property owners who would be interested in accepting it. Do you know of any other organizations that are kind of currently trying to create a centralized wait list or a common application portal?
Not necessarily for common application portal, but just looking at row 58 that you had identified with like CED and HACA and Buncombe County Planning and Thrive, maybe seeing if there are, like understanding that Thrive works in other cities as well, or has partnerships in other cities as well. Like if there is something else that could be leveraged, either that is local to Asheville, or maybe that someone else has implemented and has information on from those implementer groups that have been identified.
Great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on shifting around of prioritization of these particular strategies? If not, we can move on to bond prioritization. All right, let's move on. This is really helpful, everyone. I really appreciate your input today. I'm really enjoying getting into the weeds like this, because this is exactly what AHAC is for in my mind. So I'm really, really grateful for all of your input so far. All right. So here we've got the strategies where I've bolded all of them that are eligible, that we've spoken with the city attorneys, and that would be eligible for bond funds because they involve some kind of capital expense. There are 3 that I have italicized because we might need to get a little nuance to exactly how the capital expense is being categorized. And I will definitely phone a friend to Nikki if there's any questions about those in particular. But as you can see, we've got bond eligible strategies spread out throughout the continuum of this plan. And I'd love to hear, if you feel like any of these, I should also say the bond most likely cannot afford to support all of these. So we're going to have to prioritize some of them. So I'd love to hear from you all some of your priorities on what you think the bond funds should be used for. Go ahead, Brian.
This is going back to my earlier point. If we look at our short-term priorities, where is building more housing for rental property?
Right.
You would say the bond wouldn't be going for that. So I think that's a big gap.
Okay.
I agree. I think we can have that in there.
Yeah.
We hear you.
Well, and maybe we
I agree.
move it from, maybe I would like to dig into the increased rental options for households with the greatest barriers. I want to dig into that again, just so I can, is that the one that we can then slot over to year 1? Does that existing framework within that implementation recommendation fit what we're talking about here? So just we'll put a note to research that.
And Nikki, you bring up, I think, a really good point. These priorities in here, I'm trying to map back to the March 22nd document, which I would understand is the most current document. Some of them don't map at all. So like enhanced existing city tools doesn't show up in the March 22nd document as a recommendation. There's 3 or 4 of them that don't. And the descriptions that are in here are still very vague. And so it's kind of like, maybe the stuff could be in what we're talking about could be put under some of these things, but it needs to be updated, because what was done in March was a draft. And now we're talking about prioritizing the final recommendations, but the recommendations are still in draft form, which I find kind of like, well, what is it we are prioritizing? So I do think there's a bit of just housekeeping that needs to be done and cleanup before this goes for final review, because we need to clearly define what are these recommendations, and something like enhancing city tools. What is that you're talking about? Enhancing which tools and in what ways?
Right.
Because we've worked on things like land use incentive grants and housing trust fund policy for years, and we've had multiple iterations of them. And if there's specific things that need to be improved in them, those need to be called out so we can work on them specifically, not have a generic mission to go back and make Luigi better.
Right. Of course. No, I absolutely hear you, Brian. And I'm impressed that you, and unsurprised also, that you've identified the couple new ones. And those were as a result of our March community engagement, stakeholder engagement sessions. There were a couple ideas that came to mind, just like today, with more explicitly addressing supporting the immediate need for additional rental properties. And so we've added those after discussing them with the staff and validating that they were priorities and ideas that came from stakeholders and community members. These stations for each and every one. We just didn't want to kind of blow up the implementation roadmap with all of those specific recommendations. But maybe there's something else that we can do to make it a little bit more explicit. So for the ones that are intuitive, do any of these jump out as particular priorities? And again, I'm happy to elaborate on any that you might have questions for. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more about some of the ones that I'm struggling to understand the capital component to, for example, facilitating a funders collaborative or building the capacity of local nonprofit developers. Obviously, like if I look at even at something like land banking, the land banking piece is clearly capital oriented, but exploring land banking, like the exploration part of that, is not bond fundable. And so these are the places where I worry that like the end result is bond fundable, but the getting there is not bond fundable. And like, how do we do the getting there part?
Right.
So that we can actually, otherwise we run the risk of either disappointing people by saying, oh, we're going to land bank with this money, but we don't know how to, we don't know how to get there. And,
yeah.
And we end up banking the wrong land, or, so some of these things, walk me through a few of these, like, particularly like the convening and facilitating and building capacity. Like, how are you seeing those things having a capital component?
And I'm happy to address that because, and perhaps I can be specific. So from my perspective, the convene and facilitate a funders collaborative, the reason why it's bond eligible is just the idea that the city would be investing a certain amount of money into a collaborative pool of funds to be used for capital expenses. And so while the convening and facilitating is certainly very much, I imagine meetings, conversations, agreements, MOUs, chart, a whole shebang with like, how would that occur? The actual ability that allows us to convene those conversations, from my perspective, is just the knowledge that we would have funding set aside to be able to contribute. Because I think there is just that little bit of push and pull. That's the reason why it's green from my perspective. Regarding the, building the capacity of nonprofit developers, I do want to clarify, and we learned this very explicitly through the support of the Hayward Street Community Development, which is the offshoot of Hayward Street Congregation, as they basically built out the community development organization that would serve as their affordable housing development arm, right? And acquired property on West Haywood using city dollars. So more to that story is that when I say capital expenses, there are some expenses that can be considered pursuit costs that can be capitalized. It has to be specific, but from my understanding, we were able to pay for surveys. We were able to pay for architectural drawings, things like that. Those expenses that can be capitalized are bond eligible. So we would need to, maybe we should put that one in italics, because we would need to narrowly tailor what could be considered for bond eligibility, but we can perhaps delineate what of pursuit costs, which I understand would be the most, which is the greatest barrier for upstart developers to be able to access opportunity. We could consider that. And so again, that's why it's green from my perspective right now.
Yeah, so I wanted maybe another angle on that. So I would assume that, developer fees in a proposal would be bond eligible because they're part of the total development. And that becomes basically the cash in hand that, or general undesignated revenue that many nonprofit developers can then use to build their own internal capacity. It's how they cover their overhead costs, right? They often end up getting negotiated away in order for those very same projects to be competitive in the course of an RFP cycle. So those are the kind of places where, yes, that's a bond eligible cost that would build capacity. But we often get into these situations in the arena of scarce resources and competitive funding proposals where we're asking people to cut that out. And that actually serves to undermine developer capacity. So I think you're on the, I like the track that you're on in terms of thinking about how you can turn non-bond eligible activities into bond eligible activities. But let's just make sure if that's what we're specifically saying we want to do, let's don't turn around and then like accidentally do the opposite when we're putting the money out on the ground.
Andy, that's such a great idea and such a great point. I really appreciate you bringing that up. You know, the fact that the bond could potentially be used for developer fees, and that also has the secondary effect of giving those nonprofits the ability to build their infrastructure and scale up their own operation. Just from your perspective, are there other ways that, you know, aside from supporting the developer fees, like are there other ways that the bond could support nonprofit developers and grow their capacity?
I mean, a lot of that feels like, you know, how we package what we are calling capital, and if we can include things like, you know, if we can fund an overall capital project and have it include pre-development costs.
Yeah.
Pre-development is the other place where like smaller developers, first-time developers often wind up taking a lot of risks.
Yes.
You know, I was meeting with a local nonprofit organization doing their first new development, and they were like, how do you go back to a funder and explain that you took their money to do this, like to do, you know, for pre-development costs, but the due diligence, you know, fell apart and the project's not going to move forward? Like, how do you explain the ones that don't move?
Yeah.
And so that really kind of, I mean, that becomes a barrier to getting new people in the game if they don't have a source that they can go to fund the projects that don't work. Right. So how do we create enough flexibility in what we're talking about around capital investments that it would include, you know, a way to fund those kinds of projects? And maybe that gets into, you know, again, that's part of the land banking strategy where the city takes the, you know, an organization can come with a potential project and say, can the city buy this and hold it while we do the due diligence process? And it sits in the land bank, and, you know, the city takes the risk on. And so in that way, they're building the capacity of local developers because they get it, you know, they get a little bit of insulation from the risk.
That's such a great point, Andy. Is how can the bond be used to minimize risk for the smaller developers? I really appreciate you bringing that up, and that's really smart. The idea of putting the properties in a land bank while the nonprofit developers do their due diligence. I love that. Great. Go ahead, Brian.
So it strikes me that some of these bond eligible ideas need to be moved forward in our process, because if the bond passes, I think we should be looking at where do we want the bond money to go.
Mm-hmm.
And if some of these things are just really complex and we can't get to them right away, I get that. So something like I don't know, exploring opportunities with tenant communities, that sort of idea. Okay, well, that's something we haven't done before. A lot of legwork required, a lot of staff work required to even figure out what it is. Okay, I understand why that's in long, but allocating critical repair and energy efficient things, we've got several nonprofit in towns that do that today. Mm-hmm. Why would we wait 4 years to even think about allocating bond money into repair programs?
Okay.
Or an acquisition fund for affordable housing or preservation of affordable housing. Why would we wait 6 years to think about preserving at-risk apartment complexes that are about to be redeveloped into 120% AMI rental properties? I think if we're going to pass the bond, we ought to go through a process that says these are the priorities within the bond spending, which should drive then staff time to take all this to the next level of detail. Otherwise, I just don't think it'll make this round of bond funding, which means it's probably longer than 10 years.
Got it. Well, and Brian, you make you bring up a great, well, first of all, thank you for that. But I'm curious, now that we do see these bond eligibility or the strategies that are bond eligible, are there other ones that folks would recommend we move up?
One of the ones I'm also curious about on here is the down payment assistance. I listened to your presentation at HCD and had the same concerns that a lot of people raised. There are no houses.
Right.
So, but I also know from my tenure on AHAC, down payment assistance has been one of the thorniest issues and something that will consume a lot of oxygen to figure out. And now you may have other material where you have a recommended down payment assistance program about how it would work and all the mechanics, because that's where we always got caught up before, was in the mechanics of how to make it work.
Right.
And I'm concerned that we would, in the short term, devote a lot of time and energy to that and allocate bond funding to it, but still have no housing for it.
Right.
Because I think it was highlighted in the meeting, you know, there are only 4 or 5 houses in the city of Asheville for sale currently under $300,000. And all of those would require probably critical repairs and energy efficiency. So
that's a good point.
I just think that is a program that if we want to push forward, needs a very holistic approach to it, where it's not just a combination of getting it's not just getting someone in a house to get stuck with $500 a month utility bills and $1,000 a month of repairs, but it is, hey, here's a complete program where we'll come in, buy a house, rehab it, and then sell it to you. Because right now, otherwise this doesn't work. And I don't know why we would make it a short-term priority to just thrash about with it and still not achieve anything. I know it's popular though, and I know a lot of people want it, but I just don't want to consume tons of staff time and allocation of bond resources to something and that at the end of the day will help very, very few people.
I want to comment on that before we move on. And I think we share a lot of those concerns. And I think coming out of the HCD meeting, I think where between staff and enterprise, we felt like where we were headed was supporting existing programs, maybe adding some partners, but we're not thinking of creating our own program. Like, you know, maybe some specific guidelines. I think there's very specific questions like about the shared equity piece, or, you know, there's certain questions, but, you know, MHO had a proposal for 5 years of down payment assistance. And, you know, it is so resource intensive that I'm not as worried about the homes being available because the people who do that will find them. And just from my time working with the CLT, we thought property was going to be the hardest thing, and it wasn't the hardest thing. The hardest thing is getting people qualified and getting the funding in place. Those tended to be the harder barriers than actually finding the homes.
Well, but I think if you only have 5 homes available, and if we qualified 50 people for the program, then 50 people pursuing 5 houses will drive up the price of those houses, which will create negative consequences for all of their neighbors when Buncombe County does a reassessment. And so I don't know that we would be helping a lot of the communities that we're targeting with this, particularly if we followed the recommendations in here where they're geographically restricted or targeted. And you might end up having a ton of negative consequences for the people who live in those communities today if you drove up the price of all the substandard housing in it by giving a bunch of people money to chase them down. And I don't think we've adequately looked at the negative consequences of that particular program.
Thank you, Brian.
Paul's been waiting, and I.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Down payment assistance. I love down payment assistance. We use it a whole lot in CHFA, Federal Home Loan Bank, MHO locally. There's down payment assistance, and there's low down payment options for mortgages. I will say it again. I love it. I think it's a necessary piece to the puzzle. I don't believe it's where our city's resources should be going.
Got it. Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks. I am curious. I'd like to solicit specific commentary on home repair because just looking at the data that is presented, and we're talking a lot about anti-displacement strategies here at the city, and with a majority of our housing stock being older than, I can't remember the date, but being older housing stock.
1980.
Thank you, Jara. Yep. I am curious about the home repair and how that strikes this group, because that would take time and effort either to use the housing trust vehicle to then focus on either it's, we could do it like a specific call for proposals for home repair. I know there's some synergy with existing providers of home repair. So I do want to just poll the group, if I may, just because it seems like that could be a place to invest that we haven't necessarily utilized housing trust fund or bond dollars for. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Tara, I believe your hand was up first. I believe you're muted.
Thank you. Nikki, I too think that I think it should be prioritized. And did the city not have a program at one time for home repair? And I would like to hear a little more about that and the effective or not nature of that program and what happened to it.
I know that we had it's quite a long time ago. I would need to pull the file. It might have been in the 90s and early 2000s. And Sasha, I don't know if you know that, but it was a rehab program that I know the city administered, and I'm fuzzy on details, but that's what I know. Sasha?
Yeah, and it was federal money, so it wasn't funded locally. And I don't know if there were, I feel like I want to say the word carrot loans. I don't know if those exist anymore, but yeah, and it definitely has its own, yeah, it's a lot to run it. We had somebody here who was an architect who inspected homes and repairs, and so it's a serious undertaking.
Okay, and so capacity may have been the issue as to why it didn't continue.
I think maybe I think yeah, they went through that federal money, and I guess I think the housing, I don't really know the full story. The housing trust fund was definitely focused on new units, and I think didn't even fund rehab really for many years. So I think, yeah.
So what I do know and have experienced adjacently was, there was a family home in the Montfort area, and being able to keep elderly people who have been in homes generationally to in homes only benefits us at the end of the day, because again, we won't have people displaced and have people looking for alternate housing. I think it's in our best interest that we help people remain in their homes for sure. And so to be able to prioritize that, I think helps us not to exacerbate an already serious issue in terms of accessibility to housing. And so, I do think that if there is a way to better prioritize it, I think that we should.
Thank you. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I had questions when I read through this about the bond eligibility of repair programs, and prior to just I think the last revision, or maybe the revision before, of Housing Trust Fund, even whole house acquisition, rehab, resale, the rehab portion wasn't Housing Trust Fund eligible, as Sasha mentioned. With Housing Trust Funds set up as a revolving loan, it's going to be really difficult to at least do the kind of home repair work that most of our home repair providers locally are doing, the need that they see. And I'll just, I'm trying to not have my Habitat hat on, but as one of our local repair providers. But what we really don't see clients who are interested in or able to afford a repayable home repair loan, or even to have a deferred payment lien placed against their home. This is in many cases this home is the asset that ensures generational wealth, and people are not interested in encumbering that property, even with the smallest size of lien. It's a very difficult issue for us to overcome. And so if we're thinking about bond funding, we're thinking about revolving loan, that kind of repayable home repair investment, it's going to be a real difficult. It will be a new program, unlike anything that our existing providers are currently administering, and we will need to find a different market to serve. I'm not saying that they're not out there, but that has been our experience. So we do have, I would say, a robust group of providers doing home repair locally, multiple agencies that are actively coordinating with one another to layer services to get to deeper levels of affordability, larger repairs. There's capacity to grow that, both in size and scope. We've, as long as it is administered efficiently, we've seen good response using, federal dollars to do that work within the city of Asheville with CDBG funds, as long as they're effectively administered. So there are a few gaps in that, particularly the eligibility of using federal funds for repairing manufactured housing is an issue that we bump up to. So if we wanted to create a local program, targeting at some of the places that are gaps in the federal program, and certainly I'm not aware of any program that currently exists that's serving, that's making repair investments to keep lower cost rental properties affordable. So that sort of business investment loan for a nonprofit or for a small landlord, as a small business owner, that would let them make improvements to their property without having to pass all of those costs on to their tenants in the form of lost affordability. So there are a few places we could tweak around the edges. I think we've got a lot of capacity locally as long as we can get it out the door. So my 2 cents on that.
So Andy, what I'm hearing is that, one of the unique advantages of bond funds is that it can be granted as opposed to the Housing Trust Fund, which serves as a revolving loan fund. And because these homes by virtue of a variety of different reasons, it's really important that if the city were to set up a home repair program, that it'd be best if it was a grant kind of program as opposed to a revolving loan in which there'd be some kind of lien placed on the property. Am I restating what you said correctly?
Yes, and thank you for making me sound a lot smarter than
It was your idea. I'm just learning and rephrasing. Great. Any other thoughts on prioritizing bond eligible strategies, or whether it's moving it up in terms of the time frame, or ones that you feel could have a critically important impact on affordable housing in Asheville?
I'd just like to make I'm going to make kind of one more plea around this. A lot of the bond eligible components of the things that we have highlighted take some administrative work or facilitating work. They probably all take community engagement work before they can be deployed. The bond eligible piece can be deployed effectively. It feels very important to me to say that we need to figure out either the staffing resources or the funding resources to pass along administrative fees to organizations who will eventually deploy bond funds in order to do the part that lets the bond eligible activities be done well. So that, we can, if we go back to the 2017 bond and down payment assistance, I think the thing that stifled our ability to get to a down payment assistance program that was acceptable community-wide was the lack of administrative fees for the organization that would provide that down payment assistance. So, if I've got to shoulder the burden of administering the down payment assistance program, I'm going to have to graft it onto something that I have administrative funding to do. And that means, those criteria are going to ride along with this new source. And so if we want those things to be deployed, in a very specific way, we need to make sure that we're recognizing the cost, either to the city for administering those or to other agencies who might partner to deploy those. But if I've got to find my own administrative funds to deploy this program, I will now layer those costs on and restrictions onto this other thing, and we may not end up getting what the community wants. So I'm going to keep beating that dead horse all the way through this process. Sorry. Thank you all.
I love it. Thank you. Nikki, I guess I'm curious, in terms of like the pursuit costs that would qualify under bond funding, does that relate at all to any kind of administrative pass-through granting or anything like that? And we can also, say we don't know yet and we'll need to ask an attorney, but I'm curious on what your initial thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, as Andy said earlier, developer fees are capitalized into the overall package for a development, so that, and what I've been told is it's always about the ability to capitalize costs. So You'll notice that, the aspect of just simple like community engagement is not a bond eligible expense, right? So I remember just going through some of the very fine details on knowing what were bond eligible expenses and what weren't. And so I think we would need to research that further. It really comes to the accounting metrics of how we would what expenses are able to be capitalized. So that's the tricky part. And again, the other part of it is understanding what's the capacity for city funding to be otherwise utilized in that way. So just getting creative with, we know we have this annual allocation for housing trust fund, just trying to then think through, okay, what are our options when we really take the full bevy of our resources to task, and I'm curious about doing that with both CDBG, home dollars, bond dollars, and housing trust fund allocation. Like I would love to see that kind of menu of funding options then correlated with each of these strategies, quite honestly, or if it's just something that would have to be driven by, philanthropy or something like that. So it's a lot to think about, and I'm unclear on the opportunities right now.
Great, thank you, Nikki. Kara, just before I call on you, I'm curious, just a follow-up question to you, Andy. Nikki brought up the point of potentially using housing trust fund dollars for that. Obviously, grants are preferred for administrative costs, but I'm curious what your thoughts would be on some kind of long-term loan that could cover those administrative costs. Do you think that would be appealing, or does that still defeat the purpose of trying to cover the added administrative costs? What do you think?
I think it would depend on the kind of program. I mean, obviously, if it was something that you could, let's say you could recoup those costs through a developer fee at the end of the project.
Mm-hmm.
A no interest loan of those costs up front might work. If you're
That's creative.
I don't know how you could do that with something like a home repair grant or administrative fees for a down payment assistance loan, unless you could capitalize that your administrative costs into closing costs on the loan or something like that. It may be that there's some way to think about that, but it's going to take more creativity than I have on the spot like this. I do think the idea about you mentioned, or Nikki mentioned, philanthropy. I mean, we have a really good example with that, with how we had how local philanthropy leveraged the federal ARP dollars.
Mm-hmm.
We had Dogwood Health Trust, who brought additional money to leverage into the kinds of investments that the city was making through ARPA, and so there's precedent for that, and I feel like that could be a really nice component to the bond initiative to say, like, the hard costs are going to be covered through the bond, and some of these pursuit costs, I learned a new term today, which makes me happy. The pursuit costs could be covered through philanthropy, or at least fronted through philanthropy.
Yeah. And actually, this reminds me of there's a initiative out of Tacoma, Washington, called the Black Homeownership Initiative, which is a funding collaborative between philanthropies, local banks, CDFIs, employers, a variety of different folks. But the thing that kind of really it's a brand new program, so there isn't a proof of product yet. But the idea is that philanthropy supports those pre-development pursuit costs to help support smaller developers, keep homes affordable, provide more opportunities for home ownership for Tacoma's Black residents, and then a more traditional low interest loan is for the actual construction loan. But anyways, that might be something that we could figure out for Asheville as well. So great. Andy, you're not giving yourself enough credit. I think that's a creative idea. Any other thoughts on, I realized actually,
Tara,
Andy,
yeah.
Tara's got a hand up.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, Tara. Yeah, or thank you both. Please, Tara, go ahead.
So I am a little concerned at this point regarding Brian's kind of cart before the horse discussion as to availability specific to stock, housing stock, and City of Asheville staffing and partner organization capacity. How does it affect the proposed work and the priority setting? I don't know if that's something that Sasha and Nikki can speak to, or Jara, what you've seen in your past work, and maybe other communities having these same kinds of issues. But I do wonder how that affects the work and the prioritization.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be happy to share that, I do think the goal around enhancing existing city tools is reflective of recognizing that the Housing Trust Fund was one of the best tools that we were able to utilize for delivering the units that were funded with bond dollars. So, and we did some work with HCD about a year ago to really just reflect on how the bond, what happened and what lessons were learned. And so I'll share those now. I do think that part of the ambition of the initial bond with respect to down payment assistance, even the community land trust support that was there, was really just to recognize it takes time to establish new programs. I'm so thrilled that we do have the community land trust that exists today, but I think and those funds were dedicated towards that use and towards the community land trust, but it's very clear that it does take time to establish programs. And so I do think that it's wise to really also reflect on the fact that our last funding round for HTF, Housing Trust Funds, saw this really nice blend of utilization across the needs of our community. So we had homeowner projects there, homeownership projects, as well as tax credit projects. I mean, so that was really good to see, is that the Housing Trust Fund is a very viable tool to allow bond dollars to flow through that vehicle as loans to then grow the fund, and additionally, support new supply. So I feel like that is something that we're coming out strong with as we go into this bond consideration. The other thing I just want to point out is we are so far ahead from where we were last time. And because I was a part of the staff team, I was the real estate manager at the time that the initial bond was passed. And so I just do recall that I feel very excited about the opportunity to have this much forethought, and do feel like we are very much have some good lessons learned and have some clear-eyed strategies on how to utilize bond dollars in the future. So I appreciate everyone's unity around that, because I think that it helps support that vision on getting the dollars out the door, and that's really helpful to have that support.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate that.
Go ahead, Brian.
So it does strike me that we made some recommendations on moving some things from medium and maybe long into short. We just have too many priorities in the short term. And we've talked about, and Tara just reemphasized it, about capacity and what's going to constrain us from getting all this stuff done. I do think we need to take a harder look at some of the things that are in top and short priorities and say, are these really, do we need them all now? Should we take time away from things like the bond programs, which have dollars behind them, to create something like a rental registry? Because this is where we talked about this when we did our review back in March. I don't know of the cost or time to do some of these things. And so if this is something we can give Thrive $10,000 and go do, yeah, go do it if we got 10 grand. If not, I would say let's take it off and move it away to another priority, to a medium or long term, if in fact it's going to cost several $100,000 and take 4 weeks or a month or 2 months of staff time to implement. Because we have a lot of stuff we want to get done in the bond. And I agree with Nikki, we're light years ahead of where we were when the first bond got passed, but there's a lot of work to do in all this. And we don't even have approval for hiring more staff at the moment to do any of it. Other than having Sasha work 48 hours a day, I don't know what other, how else we're going to get everything done.
That's a great point, Brian. I hear you that you're not sure how long these will take or how much they'll cost, but are there any in the top or short that you feel could be deprioritized given our conversation today?
Well, again, I would say I would go through, and this partly has to be done in conjunction with the city, to go like, well, what funding is available for them?
Right.
Do we have money in community and economic development to fund a rental registry?
Right.
If not, there's no point in having it in short-term priorities. If the software alone cost $100 grand, right, and another, say if I had a consultant do it, another $100 grand, do you have 200 grand, Nikki? Okay, if we don't have 200 grand, let's move, because it's not bond eligible. Let's move it to medium.
Yeah.
Extending tenant protections, again, with access to legal assistance. If there's a dollar amount that we need to grant to Pisgah Legal to do that, and we have a couple of $100,000 we could grant to that, then great, let's leave it in. But if not, let's be realistic, because I would like us to say when we go back in a year from now, how have we progressed on these things? And if there's no budget for any of them, we will not have progressed on them at all.
Right.
So you could move them in short-term priorities, but unbudgeted. I've done that with clients before, where you say, like, this is an important thing to do. We should do it right away. We have no money for it right now. So you don't lose track of it. But I just don't. The way this is being presented now, in particular, when something like build rental registry is at the top of the short-term list, kind of go like, well, is it real? That's not our top priority.
Right.
So it's just, I just want to make sure we're realistic about money we have available to spend on things and staff resources we have to spend on things. And if we don't have it, let's just call it what it is we are, it's an appeal to city council to give us more money for these things. But in lieu of that, it has to be deprioritized. Important, but not on top of the list. Right.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. That's a really helpful way to think about this that we hadn't really considered yet. I should also clarify that the suggestions in each column are not in themselves prioritized. So building a rental registry is not the top priority for short term. It's just that all of those would be priorities, and based on the funds available, the capacity available, the housing landscape, the momentum behind them, the need behind them, which ones should be pursued in those 2 or 3 years. But I can certainly see how, based on how it's presented right now, that interpretation could be made. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I completely agree with the idea that if you're going to call something year one top priorities and you're going to say this plan is aimed at 60% and addressing displacement all across the board, like, you got to be careful, because some of these things are directly aimed at that and can't be pushed back. And if it's feasibility is the issue, it still needs to be listed as a top priority so that we can make the case to the community. So that city council can make the case to the community that this is worth investing in. And if you don't prioritize it in a way that really shows what the community needs right now, you just talk about what's possible with bond funding, or we don't know how we're going to get the money for that, or who's going to administer it. I mean, I think Andy and Brian have been doing this for so long. They're just pointing out really, how this might play out if we don't get to the specifics. Yeah, and right now you've got us all here talking about the roadmap, and I agree with Nikki that it's really encouraging. We're all focused on it before the plan's even gone. But I see why Brian would say you take some things out, but I also think maybe categorizing them and splitting things up, like, this is what we're going to do and this is when we're going to do it by. It doesn't cost that much money, and this is going to require a huge investment from our community, and we either need to raise taxes or spend money that we were going to spend on something else doing this. And the only other thing I'll say is I had a question about why reducing regulatory barriers citywide wasn't something that would be in year one top priority, and there might be reasons for that. I just wasn't sure what they were.
That's a good question. I know that we've been discussing that in concert with the planning department. Sasha, do you think you could pipe in on our
I missed that
conversation with
last.
Chris?
Which one are you talking about, David?
Row 12, B12, reduce regulatory barriers citywide.
Because you've got increased awareness of existing resources and increased regulatory incentives, but we've identified that there are just some policies in place that are preventing affordable housing from being developed. And we've looked at, zoning and all these things. It's been talked about quite a bit. And that's a problem that I think nationwide we've seen. Like, that's what cities can do kind of immediately, is like loosen some of the barriers. And I just wonder why that would be in the short term.
It's in the short term because planning's actually already working on that. And the Planning and Zoning Commission has been pushing really hard on some of this. And so there is current momentum around changing thresholds. There's the whole missing middle conversation that's happening. And so I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, but there is energy and staff time that's being put towards this right now. So it made sense to try to, and also, let me just back up and say this. I don't want to take too much time, but Shane Phillips was here, and his 3 things are supply, subsidy, and stability. And I will say that, so some of this is coming from that lens of like, let's increase supply. How do we increase supply? We change some of these, the planning stuff, the zoning stuff, and so we were trying to achieve a balance in our top priorities of those strategies.
I'll just say that based on what was said earlier, if it's already started, so if you've already begun doing it, then that would be fall into your one top priorities, because obviously it's an ongoing thing. But if that's the case where we're already looking at it, then I think we're doing that.
Great. Thank you, David. Jane, I believe you were next.
Yeah, I was just curious, kind of, definitely agree with staffing capacity and understanding cost of all of these. Along with the prioritization, could it be useful to add an additional column in the sheet one that identifies like, this is supported by the missing middle study, this is supported by some of the other studies, to show work that has already been in place and to underpin any of these particular strategies, to add additional emphasis to some of them, kind of like what David was speaking to with regards to like, could we change zoning? That's already in place. That's been identified in the missing middle study. We have these different prongs that are already moving forward with regards to momentum. This should be an area of emphasis, just to really drive an additional emphasis among the strategies that are in play.
That's a really interesting idea. I think I'm going to take a look at that. Thank you, Jane. Scott, I believe you had your hand up. Took it down.
I wonder if the conversation that we've just been having around resources, I mean, there's a couple of things that are swirling in my head thinking about this. One is how we've grouped things by priority. We're mixing together the important and the feasible, and calling those priority. And that's dangerous, right? Because the community has told us what's important to them. And then we're coming back and saying, yes, but we can do this. So like it gets really easy to like slide into, well, we're going to do what we know how to do. So I wonder if it's as simple as, kind of, maybe there's a visual organizer, my brain always goes to a quad chart in resting mode. So is there a way to sort this that's like, these are the important things and these are the feasible things, and we clump some things together into, high importance, high feasibility, and, just look at this in a slightly kind of parse this out between, between what's important to get done, what fits the most with those two cross-cutting priorities, and separate out the things that are like, we've made this a priority just because we think we know how to do it. So the second thing along that line, I wonder if it's, given the conversation we had about sort of what's bond eligible, what can we raise through general budget dollars at the city, I wonder if it's worth elevating the idea of a funders collaborative from medium to short or even top, to just say, we really need to sit down with all of the players who could fund parts of this plan or resource parts of this plan, and like start to get them on board that this is the plan.
Right.
That, we've looked at this, it's been vetted. This is the community's roadmap to achieving, to avoiding displacement and serving, very low income households, and start to get all of the funders, working in alignment with this. So that when something comes up, to use Brian's example a minute ago, if it's going to cost us $200,000 to build a rental registry and the city doesn't have it,
right.
That when someone puts that proposal together and goes to a funder and says, I want $200,000 to start a rental registry, it's not coming. That's not the first time they're hearing that idea.
Right.
They already understand that that's an aligned goal with the city's affordable housing plan.
Right. Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. I too am a fan of the quad system, I should say. In fact, one of our first exercises with the city was doing something like that. But
And I do want to do a time check here. I think,
Oh, yes.
Sarah,
Sorry.
you were thinking of like asking if there's anything missing. I don't know if there's another question, and then we should leave a little bit of time for public comment at the end.
Right. So I was going to take us through the real road, like the more detailed roadmap, though recognizing what time it is, and I apologize that I let that slip away from me. I don't know if, I mean, I guess we could jump to it, and then if there are any strategies that we really want to zero in on, we could talk about those. That said, like I would also love to just crowdsource any thoughts. So if you all have access to this, if you have thoughts on or questions about particular actions, ideas for funding or partner organizations, you know, we'll take any and all of it that you have. Andy, I kind of defer to you on the best course of action. I do have, you know, those general questions that I could rehash or restate, which is, are we missing anything crucial? We've had a great conversation about where these should fall prioritization wise, both in time frame and bond. So I think we've covered those pretty well. And then the last question was kind of getting more into the weeds. So I refer you all to how to best use our remaining time.
Okay. We also, I'm remembering back to one of your early slides that said we were going to have, we wanted to have a smaller working group of AHAC, spend a little bit of time on this. We should identify who those people are going to be. And that may be the place to go even more.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea.
That may be an important use of our time. But let me get Scott's question before we pivot.
Sure. Thank you. I actually was just going to say thank you so much for the conversation so far. I actually need to leave shortly for a meeting, but one specific comment I had, if you're going to page 5 of the spreadsheet under goal 5, broaden and strengthen the affordable housing ecosystem and tools. And then I think it is under, let me find that right quick. That is under increase, let's see, page 5. Yes. So it's pretty much the last bullet, refresh city website with pages, downloadable resources for developers, builders, whatnot. I would say in terms of the implementers column, definitely add DSD, its development services department. So
great.
Kind of a little bit oddly in Asheville, we technically have 2 planning departments. Planning and urban design is sort of, you know, updating the UDO and doing generally more either downtown or long range planning and urban design, and then DSD is who you go to when you want a permit for something. So in terms of, and I know it's, you know, a lot of conversations around it, but in terms of trying to do either process mapping or getting things out that are publicly accessible that give you a clear outline of, hey, you want to get a right-of-way entry permit, follow these steps, you're building X. They have some of that already, but it's just, I think it's probably a, you know, larger conversation around trying to do both internal process mapping and also getting a duplicate of that the public can see, particularly if you're a, you know, small developer, first-time developer, different things like that. So I would, yeah, in terms of that specific implementers, I would definitely suggest trying to get DSD involved as well as the planning and urban design department.
Great. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all's time. Thank you.
And so, Andy, actually, to your point about creating that work group, I would love if, and maybe this is what you were already thinking, you know, that work group could theoretically get started on working on the roadmap right now while we finish up the actual language of the draft plan. And then by the time June 10 comes around, that work group can then look at the draft plan. And that way you've got something that can be really helpful to us over the next, you know, week and a half or so. So that would be tremendously helpful. I would certainly appreciate that.
Okay, well, let's get into that. I wanted real quick, Elena, Stewart, we haven't heard from either of you in this discussion, and I want to make sure that we're not, you know, leaving anybody's brilliance out of anything that either of you would like to add.
I think that my colleagues, you guys have hit all the targets. I didn't have the language, so I just relied on you, and I think you guys did a great job, and I thank you for that.
All right. Thanks, Lena. Stewart, anything from you? Parting thoughts? Okay, I'm not hearing from Stuart. So let's talk about who would be interested in spending a little bit more time digging into this over the next week or so. The next 10 days, I guess, is what it would be to really, yes, Sasha?
Well, and then in June 10th, the idea here is that we would, with that small group, give you the draft plan to then go through. So it'll be spread out over a longer period of time.
Okay, so I don't think the amount of time was going to hinder anybody who's about to volunteer to do this. So folks who are interested in more of what we did today, bringing us to the end of this planning process.
I'd be happy to help depending on the timing.
Okay. Wayne, I'm seeing your hand on that. Is that a yes?
Yes, depending on the timing also, but I'll volunteer.
Okay. Well, we'll figure out who it is and then we'll get the timing to work.
See Tara, David, and Jane.
Tara, David, and Jane. That
Six people.
Yeah,
what?
I can.
And Paul raised his hand.
And Paul.
Yeah, I don't need to be on it. I'm willing to do it. Seems like you might have enough.
Okay. We can't have more than 5. Is that right, Sasha?
I think we weren't really thinking of doing meetings.
Okay.
Unless y'all want to meet. So.
Isn't the June 10th thing a meeting?
No. That was kind of our deadline, our internal deadline, that we were giving you a draft, handing over a draft to review. I know it was on Jared's slide. He didn't intend for that to be a meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
You probably should get as many as you can because a few of us are saying according to time.
Yeah. Well, if it's just sitting down with the draft document and digging in more kind of independently, and we're not having to pull together as an actual working group, and but I think if we could do that informally, as long as we didn't exceed a quorum of the committee, right? So if you wanted to take your sheets of paper on this and accidentally all show up at the same coffee shop, as long as there weren't more than 6 of you.
Another method is we could make a copy of this spreadsheet as another Google spreadsheet, and you all can
work in it collaboratively.
Exactly, at your leisure.
Okay.
I'd defer to you all.
Okay.
Great.
Let's do that. Let's set up a document that we can all work in collaboratively. Folks can add or subtract from that. I do think I don't know, I'm old school. I do think it would be helpful to have a few people, once we got that draft document, once we got a lot of input in it, to really sit down and hash through things. And I think we got a few people who were enthusiastic about getting our heads together. So maybe I'll pull that together. Jared, would it be more helpful for us to get together before you give us something on the 10th or after you give us something on the 10th?
I suppose it would be, just because we're wrapping this up, the sooner the better. But I understand you all have other lives and aren't being paid to be here. So I'll take the feedback by June 10th if that's what ends up being the case.
Okay. All right. Does that sound good? Everybody know what we're doing? Yes. Brian, you're on mute. What you got?
Yeah. So are we going to get a revised document that we're going to comments into? Is that I just want to be clear on what it is.
The roadmap, you mean? The roadmap piece?
Well, I think there are revisions to the original strategy document that you referred to.
So that will be June 10th. Right now, we're just talking about the more detailed roadmap that has the columns with, prioritization, although I will update the priorities based on today's discussion. but update with the spreadsheet that has the prioritization, has the implementers and the funding and the specific actions below each strategy. That's what I would love for you all to work on for now. And then on June 10th is when you'll have the full draft of the plan, which includes updated and expanded explanations and definitions and steps for the specific recommendations.
So once you reshift things between the columns and the spreadsheet, I think what would be most helpful is to do what Andy was suggesting earlier. If we then break that into 2 rows, the first row being things we can accomplish with existing city staff resources and new bond funding anticipated. And then the row below that would be additional city staff required and or additional outside resources from a funding collaborative, so that we know like what should we be working on, because if we don't get any more city staff resources, there's going to be a lot of things on that list are going to fall to the bottom row because there'd be no way for us to get them done.
Right. But I would love, I would love also specific ideas for implementers or funding partners or whatever the case may be. So I wouldn't want to just focus on the prioritization of these strategies. I'd also love to get y'all's feedback on.
No, again, I'm not changing the priority of them. I'm just changing which ones are unfunded. I'm just saying we can fund some of these things with bond money and existing staff resources.
Okay.
With Sasha and her team's time and a $20 million in bond money, what can I do? And then there's a bunch of stuff that are still high priority, but we don't have funding for right now. And then for those, we can start to think about where would we get the money. But they're not changing their priority. They're just saying they're unfunded. And because I think that sends the right message to council, which is, hey, pick something off of there, doing a renter's registry is not unimportant. It's just we don't know where the money's going to come from. Or funding more money for legal assistance, terribly important. We just don't know where the money's going to come from. And so that's up to then to council to say, oh, well, we actually control the purse strings. I can raise taxes and give you that money. Or, oh, if it's just a matter of giving community and economic development 2 more staff positions, hey, I can do that. But it does lay out, at least for council, their decisions. And if they don't choose to do them, then we know what's unfunded.
Got it.
So I guess what I would say to that is that I don't think we're going to be able to turn that around in like a day.
Right.
Because that's a several steps of work for that. And it's not that it's not a good idea, it is, but and just to maybe Nikki, I don't know if you want to address this, but in terms of staffing, I guess what I would say to you all is we struggle to do what we're supposed to do well, right? We're not doing it well. I don't feel like, or as well as we should be. And so with current staffing, we can't do new things. Period. Except, I mean, there might be some education stuff, but what we could do with current staffing is maybe kind of make general improvements around the edges, right? Around the Luigi, with the tools evaluation that's coming, we can make some changes to Luigi policy, make that better. We can make some changes to affordable, whatever. But my understanding is if the bond passes, then, and Nikki, we would council would be looking at staffing next year. Or do you want to speak to that, Nikki? I'm not going to say it right.
Sure, and that's absolutely right. I mean, I think, as you all know, we've been going through the budget process right now, and our budget is extremely tight this year. And so that's why we're not seeing an expansion of staffing for affordable housing, just because there were so many constraints on our current budget. But our plan, just from my perspective, is to look at these priorities. Sasha and I were going to, at the conclusion of the affordable housing plan, then start to look at a staffing plan for the priorities, right? For those new things that we may want to tackle that could be bond eligible. So just doing a lot of that thinking as a step 2 after the affordable housing plan is completed. And then, yes, my understanding is that would also be my opportunity as a department director to then share information with through the budget process on what appropriate staffing would look like to be able to deliver on plan elements that we wanted to prioritize. So I'm just sharing with you my strategy as the department director and how I understand that we can have a pathway towards seeing additional staff capacity given the outcome of the bond referendum.
I mean, I think in an overall sense, that's a great approach. I think as a reader of this plan, you would think this is what you're going to go do, and it's not. AHAC could say, yes, we think this is a great plan, but we fully know going through this discussion that it ain't going to happen.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind, because again, my frame is we just had the National Alliance last year, right, come and give us 45 strategies, right? And so we ended up picking like 3 to begin with, right? Establish the COC, work on expanding shelter, and I think encampment policy was the next one. David, you probably were on one of those committees. But, the thing is like we do need to be ambitious, because I think why we have enterprise here is to give us show the mirror. How's Asheville doing? What do we do well? What are our constraints vis-a-vis, Dillon's rural state? And just be very clear-eyed about that. But I do think there's part of plans that have ambition, but there's also the reality of implementing. And we do have to strike that balance. And again, I was leaning into how we looked at the work that we did with the National Alliance to just say, yes, if we were to have these stretch goals for what we wanted to accomplish, our plan just needs to say it, right? Because we do want it to be a living document that we can pick up. So I totally hear it. And I'm so appreciative that we can have these conversations here and try to really assemble that. But I also want to have a robust tool that gives us a toolkit, because it may not be that the city is the one who establishes a rental registry. Would love to see that come out of the community. And I love too the fact that it's named in the plan.
No, I agree with you 100%, but how would someone else in the community know that they need to do that, because the city won't be doing it? My point is that we have probably 2/3 of what's in there for recommendations that can't be done because there's no funding for them. And when you're reading the report at the end of the day, that needs to be somewhat called out. Otherwise, how would Dogwood or anyone else know that they might want to open their checkbook and say, I will pay for that then?
Well, and so let's make that note, Jara. And if we need to then help frame that up in the executive summary or something like that, then let's.
There is some language already in the plan about that. I will say, just having read it this morning, there is some, and maybe we need to make sure where it's placed. And yeah.
I'm so sorry. I've got to run, but
and I'm going to end us there so that we can get to public comment before we, the folks who've been patient on the line, have to go to whatever they're doing next. So do we have folks, Sasha, do you have public comment?
There is someone on the line, but they haven't raised their hand to make any public comment. So I'll say no. There's no one asking to make public comment.
Okay, so if there is no other public comment, is there any other discussion for the committee? We got a few other things on our agenda that we'll catch in our June agenda. I think it was just sharing out the the Housing Trust Fund awards, and maybe we can do that by email or something like that. So,
and I'll be in touch about the June meeting. There is the council work session with Jara will be in town, and I think Andy had an idea of AHAC meeting the day before to just get AHAC feedback on the plan before it goes to council. But since not everyone was going to be here, I didn't ask everybody to bring their calendars, and we've run out of time. So I will be in touch shortly about that.
Thanks, Jara. Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all right, so we'll take a motion to adjourn, and I'm going to count Tara's wave as that motion, and Paul's wave is the second, and we'll all in favor leave the meeting and call ourselves adjourned.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Tara.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.